Hey, everybody, back for the last lecture before the midterm, or last class on the Good Life unit. We're going to be talking today about the connection between moral virtue and the good life. And I've got a picture of Lisa Tessman from Binghamton University over here. And basically, we're going to talk today about Tessman and her rejection of the kind of argument you found in Besser, the main conclusion. And it'll be a lead into what we'll be doing when we turn back towards morality in the next part of the course. So just to remind you, Besser argued that there is an objective standard for a good human life. And in particular, she argued virtue, moral virtue, is necessary to have a good life. It's not sufficient. So you could be virtuous and not have a good life, but it's a necessary condition. You've got to have it if you want to have a shot at a good life. Her argument was that humans have an innate need for relatedness, and that this need for relatedness can only be really fulfilled if we're on good terms with most people. And that this type of relatedness on good terms couldn't just be play acting. It has to be infused with genuine care and respect for others. And it's by having those kinds of relationships infused with care and respect for others, both with strangers and people who are close to us in our group, that we can satisfy the need for relatedness and have a good life. And so in order to have all that, you need to be a morally good person. So that is basically Besser's argument that for the importance of virtue for a good life. And what Tessman does is she's going to step back and talk a little bit about the different types of social contexts you could be in and focus on our social context. And so she thinks in our context, there are groups that are more dominant and there are other groups that are more oppressed, and there are systemic forms of injustice. And she wants to draw your attention to that in certain dominant groups, there are people who are real jerks and they exhibit moral vice. She mentions these people could be vicious because they're in the dominant position, they can get away with it. And they might also act viciously in order to protect their dominance, ensure their dominance. For example, they might be cruel or greedy or self-centered or arrogant or cowardly. That's a list she has. So people can get away with that kind of behavior in the dominant group, and they might use those as means to ensuring their dominance. Okay, now she also talks about in other work what it's like to be someone in a more oppressed group or less dominant group in a society like ours. And she says, if you look at the moral virtues that people have, it can actually be a little bit more costly to have and develop virtues if you're in the oppressed group. So if you think about compassion and patience and a commitment to justice, you might think of those as moral virtues. The idea is, first of all, it's harder and more costly for oppressed people to develop and embody those. So think about it. It's a lot easier to be compassionate and patient if you're someone who's born into the 1% and you don't face any kind of systemic mistreatment. That's obviously, it's not that it still will be an accomplishment and a good thing if you're compassionate and patient, but it's just a little bit easier than if you're born into an oppressed group with poverty and no opportunities. Similarly, she thinks moral virtue might have an extra burdensome dimension for people who are oppressed. And so when we think about that, would be, say, the commitment to justice, that you might think that if someone sticks up for injustice and they're in some beat down group, they might get more pushback on that, a negative pushback on that, than someone who's in a more dominant group could point out to the same injustice, and they're not going to bear those same types of costs. And so we'll talk about, as we go on in the next section, some more issues surrounding this, but she just thinks this is empirically true, that there's, being virtuous is a little bit more demanding for people who are in oppressed groups, who are in the face of injustice, rather than the people who are in a better situation. But then she also thinks there are these people in a better situation who are not being good. And so she's not saying everybody in one class are good people and the other are bad. She's talking about, there are good and bad people in both groups, but a difference between them. And so what she wants to focus on in this article is mainly this question of these jerks in the dominant class. Does their moral vice rob them of a shot at human flourishing? So Besser said, you have to have virtue to have happiness and flourishing, have a good life. Okay, that's what Tessman is going to push back against, because she thinks these are going to be people who look like they are not good people. And she's going to say, but maybe they do have flourishing and happiness. So how does she go about this? Well, one thing is you want to get in mind who she's thinking about. So again, she's not talking about everybody in every top category who's less oppressed. these are bad people. So she's got a misogynist who thinks he's more important and superior than women. He discriminates them, fights measures to make things equal, and assaults women. So it's a really bad person, right? A vicious person. And then she talks about a person who's very rich. And they similarly, it's not just that they're in the 1%, there are people in the 1% who could have moral virtue. This person has moral vice. And similarly, then she mentions a racist who it's not just that he happens to be in a racial group that suffers less oppression. This guy is actually a racist. So he spreads harmful stereotypes, gathers in hate groups and terrorizes people on the street. Okay, so these are people who have vice and they look like they might get away with it. And they're using vice as a means to entrench their dominance. So she wants to know if Besser's right, then the fact that they have these vices, it detracts from how well they can live, right? It sort of blocks them from having a truly flourishing life. And so she wants to attack that. Here's her initial argument, the way I reconstruct it. If virtue is necessary for a happy and flourishing life, so that's Besser's thesis, then vicious members of dominant groups do not lead truly happy and flourishing lives. So I think Besser would grant that. She'd say, look, they don't satisfy their need for relatedness, like that misogynist we just talked about. Okay, but Tessman continues, if the vicious and dominant people cannot lead happy and flourishing lives, then the claim that the oppressed are especially harmed by being morally damaged loses some of its force. So she thinks intuitively, we think part of what's bad about oppression is it's causing harm to these people on the bottom of the pyramid. And at the expense, the people who are getting the benefits are at the top. And so she thinks, okay, that would be weird. Then, so basically, if you say that the people who have at the top who are vicious, they're robbed of their shot at a flourishing life and happiness because of their moral vice, then you have to say oppression is not, according to this line of thinking, particularly more harmful, at least in this respect, to its victims than to its perpetrators. And she thinks that seems to be a mistake. It seems to be a mistake to maintain that oppression operates in this way. So her initial argument is born out of this worry that if you say the vice of the people at the top of the pyramid detracts from their happiness, you're kind of making it seem like oppression is bad for the people who are actually perpetuating the oppression. And that seems sort of backwards. So she's going to want to argue, actually, virtue is not necessary for a happy and flourishing life. And she's going to say, it turns out that members of the dominant groups who are vicious are in fact beneficiaries of oppression. What does that mean? They're living high on the hog, and they are vicious, but they're still living happy lives. So she wants to defend that because she thinks it's the right way to think about oppression. One thing I'd say is I'm not convinced that this is really a sound argument, but I think nonetheless her arguments about a way of thinking about why you could maintain that these people are happy is quite plausible and worth taking seriously. So even if you don't buy that first part, you should be paying attention to the main argument she gives about why she thinks these people could be happy. So she's trying to convince you that these vicious people can lead happy lives. So remember, Besser said humans have an innate need for relatedness and moral virtue is necessary to satisfy the need. Here's how I would reconstruct what Tessman is saying, is that there are actually two kinds of social relatedness that you should distinguish. There's kind of a relatedness you could have in an ancient ideal of a harmonious, perfect polis. So it's a Greek word for like a small city state. So you could say basically like a perfect, ideal, just, wonderful community. There's a kind of relatedness you could have in like a utopian, small, wonderful community that's perfectly just and everybody's in agreement. Okay, then Tessman thinks, guess what? None of us live in these perfect, ideal, small communities that are harmonious where everyone gets along. We live in differentiated modern societies where there are people with disagreements about what's good and right and wrong, what religion is correct, and everything else. So what we have differentiated social circles in different parts of our life, and we have relatedness showing up in each one of those. And she basically wants to argue virtue would be necessary in order to have the kind of relatedness you could get in this sort of ideal imagined world of a perfect community. But in the real world, we can't have that special kind of relatedness. The kind of relatedness we can have, which is actually good, is the kind you don't need virtue for. So that's how she's going to argue. So now what's this distinction I'm pointing to that she mentions? basically she's saying, if you look at ancient writers in Greece, and I would add, you get similar thing in China with the Confucians, that they have an idea that ideally we would live in kind of harmonious city states. And they think human beings are social animals and they could flourish as leaders and contributors to an ideal, vibrant, appreciative community that's just and harmonious. So imagine a utopia, right? In that scenario, virtue and good character would be honored by the community, recognized by the community, and you would have this immensely valuable form of social relatedness. So everyone in the society would recognize the good things you've done and honor you for them. And you would feel great sense of self-worth and belonging. And you'd be confident that you knew what you were doing was morally right. That's because the society would be so just and harmonious and everyone would agree on what's morally right and wrong. That's not what our world looks like. So what she thinks is that in our modern differentiated pluralist societies, what we have is a very, very different setup. And so one thing she says is our individual lives are fragmented into pieces. People move from work to home to neighborhood to places of consumption. Think about when you go through your day, you cycle through different social environments. And the virtues that make you a good friend or a child are not necessarily the same as the virtues you need to succeed at work or school or to do well in a competitive marketplace. And those can actually conflict. The demands of those different domains can actually conflict. And so she says society itself is also fragmented into multiple overlapping, sometimes clashing groups. So there are different communities of sense that hold opposing ideas of what the good life is, different ideas of morality, and different ideas of virtue. So one thing you could think, like, struggles to achieve work-life balance. That's her first point, is that as individuals, you might have one set of things you're trying to do to be good at your career, but then you're also trying to say, be a good parent or be a good friend. You have those conflicting demands, they pull you in different directions, right? And those virtues, being better at one, may detract from the other. So they may come at the expense of each other. The other thing she's pointing to is in our modern society, you have a lot of choices. There's a lot of disagreement about how to live the good life. And you get to individualize from the way you grew up and make your own choices. So what conception of the good life are you going to endorse and pursue? It may be different than your parents, or it could certainly be different than other people in the class. So we have this sort of plurality. And because we have this value pluralism, people get to individualize and make their own choices about what direction they want to go in life. As a result, whatever life you choose and you take to be developing virtues, you can't expect everyone who you relate to think that what you're doing is good and the best. So you're just not living in a harmonious polis where everyone's going to affirm you if you're living in a certain way. And so she thinks you can't really hope for that sort of ideal type of affirmation. And so you might think of, if you've watched any videos about people who, for example, live in an Amish community, there are some subcultures in our society where people do live in very small, closed social environments that might be closer to the ideal harmonious polis. But she's thinking for most of us, we don't live in that situation. And so what she thinks, what kind of relatedness can we have? Okay, so here's what she says, I think, in a modern world, we can't have that kind of social relatedness and appreciation of virtue that the ancients thought would be ideal, because we just don't live in closed, harmonious societies anymore. And in the modern world, your happiness is going to be in good part determined by socially and structurally supported beliefs in your own virtue and in the goodness and happiness of your life. So she's granting you still need this relatedness to other people in order to support your beliefs and your feelings about yourself and what you're doing being morally good and being worthwhile, and that you're living a good life. So you might think, in one way, it's definitely true that nowadays we're more in our own individual bubbles. We're not all connected up into one big polis, but we're not totally just individually apart, separated forever. And I think this is where she's making a really good point, that people do look for a sense of social recognition and support and approval of their life choices, that they're living a good life, and their moral views. So you might think of, at one point I lived in grad school with my wife. We lived in Boys Town, Chicago. It's a prominent gay neighborhood. Think of pride parades. People choose to move to a certain area where they're going to be surrounded by other people that have their values and their beliefs about what's morally right or wrong. And people are going to affirm that their way of life is a good one. And that's a kind of socially and structurally supported belief in the validity of their own choices about morality and the goodness and happiness of their lives. And that's a way real social relatedness can be good in the modern world. But so, of course, now imagine people who might feel that social and structural support of their beliefs and feelings in that environment, they may not feel them somewhere else. That's an artifact of our pluralism, that not everyone shares one conception of good life. Okay. Now, given that that's how the world is, she thinks, now let's think about the people who are the dominant jerks in our situation. The thing is, you can surround yourself by people who will give you structural and social support for your belief in your own virtue, the goodness and happiness of your life. And guess what? It's all wrong. So you can be surrounded by people who are blind, leading you forward in your direction, which is also not good. And so she thinks vicious members of dominant groups can enjoy socially and structurally supported beliefs in their own virtue and the goodness and happiness of their lives. So they're surrounded by people and by a social structure that doesn't, it sort of blinds them to the fact that they're jerks. It blinds them to the fact that they shouldn't be acting the way they are towards other people. And so she thinks it turns out that members of dominant groups can in fact be the beneficiaries of oppression. They get to be vicious and still lead happy lives because they surround themselves by a social environment that reinforces their belief that they're good and their belief that they're living a good life and they deserve what they're getting. So that is her idea, is that you could live a happy life and be vicious because you're systematically led to not be aware of that and have false beliefs that you're not actually vicious. So that is her idea, that you could be sort of happy even though you're vicious in this kind of group. Okay, so I want to do now hit the pause and just try to think about what you think about that. Do you think that someone who's in a dominant group, but they're surrounded in that way by a bubble that enables them to have false beliefs that they're virtuous? When you try to imagine one of the characters that we're thinking about in that way, do you actually think that that would be sufficient for them to have a kind of relatedness that would be sufficient for them to fulfill their human need for relatedness in the way Tessman talked about it? So on the think sheet, I'll have you think back from last class's think sheet, your friend who might be becoming more of a jerk. Could that person be surrounded by others who teaches them what they're doing is actually a good way to live? Could that be sufficient to fulfill their need for relatedness or not? And we'll come back after that. Okay, so we're back from the think sheet, and I'm going to talk about Tessman now does think that maybe those vicious people, so if they're living in a bubble, they're surrounded by people who say what they're doing is good. So they are vicious people, but they aren't really aware of it. They might be missing something in the sense that they might be ignorant. So she says there's a remaining link between virtue and well-being, and it lies in the fact that thinking of yourself as a morally good person contributes to your happiness. It'll be important for members of the privileged group to be able to sustain the image of themselves as being good. So in order for them to stay happy, they're going to really have to hold on to this false belief that they're not vicious, which they really are. So one way that can happen is indifference. And so she thinks they could have a vice that enables other vices. It permits the bearer to think of him or herself as a good person by masking the effects of her cruel, unjust, callous, violent forms of action. So in the paper, she gives some examples, like someone might mistreat people in some other race and then have some ideology they've imbibed that's going to convince them that these people aren't really being hurt. So they might be like, oh no, they don't mind being treated that way. So you can imagine someone who's mistreating people and thinking, they tell themselves a story about how the people aren't really being harmed, that people don't really mind, that people are okay with it, when they're really not. So they're sort of not aware of it. They're denying the harm that they're visiting on other people. Another way to be indifferent is you just don't pay any attention to it. So maybe you participate in some kind of social system that's leading to systemic harm to people on another part of the globe. You just don't know anything about it. So you could just more straightforwardly be ignorant of what's going on. There's also cases of false entitlement, or what you'll see Kant, the philosopher we'll talk about next, called self-conceit, where people think they're special, and that because they're special, that it is right or even required for others to sacrifice their self-respect and well-being to serve their ends. So there are people who think, look, I'm special, I deserve special treatment. And these other people are getting treated like second-class citizens. That's because they're second-class citizens and I'm the first-class citizen. So some people have this sense of entitlement that they think they're more important, they deserve unequal treatment. And ultimately that there's not a good justification for that. And so that will be another way that people sometimes justify to themselves their own vicious behavior and the benefits they get from it. So overall, she thinks one can be happy while others suffer, and one can have a sense of well-being affirmed by the intersubjective agreement of others like you. And she thinks, in principle, this is an agreement that you ought to refuse. So she thinks this is what can happen, is that you can be less than moral. You can be morally bad or morally vicious, but you can be surrounded by a social system that keeps you blind to the effects of your actions, and maybe tells you somehow that, you know, you're better than other people, so you deserve this, and it sort of justifies the unequal treatment. But she doesn't think you should be satisfied with that. You should always be worried, and you should want to know the moral truth about what's really morally justified and what isn't. So you shouldn't just go along with the sense that everything seems morally okay. You need to really get to the bottom of it. And she says it with a mood of caution, because she knows the more sensitive you are to the injustice that you might be caught up with in your life, it can cause real anguish and make you upset. And that's a lot of suffering to face. But she thinks, you know, you basically need to face up to it. So now, to sum up Besser versus Tessman, Besser argued that humans have an innate need for relatedness, that required to be on good terms with most people, required us to have relationships infused with genuine care and respect, and therefore true virtue is necessary for the good life. Tessman's argued against this. She said, okay, well, look, the people who aren't virtuous, there's maybe some kind of relatedness they can't have, but what they can get enough, and what they really need for happiness is some kind of affirmation that they're good morally, and that their life is a good one and worth pursuing. And they can get that from their in-group of people who maybe also are potentially also vicious or not perfectly good. And so there could be sort of these bubbles that people live in that facilitate the false belief that they're a good person and they'll have a sense of self-worth. So one thing you want to think about here is, do you think that Tessman's story, the kinds of people she's painting, is it going to get you all the relatedness that Besser was talking about? Okay. And if not, do you think that there's some way in which their lives will be less fulfilling and good? So, and we could think about that from the objective point of view, but you could also think about for yourself, what kind of relatedness are you looking for in order to have a good life? And what does that say about how moral you think you need to be? And so basically, we don't live in an ancient and harmonious polis. So even if you have good character and virtue, you can't count on always being honored by a harmonious and just community of a utopia, right? You don't live in utopia. So you might choose certain things that are morally good, and you might not, some people might not like them. So the other thing is, because there's a kind of pluralism of different views, you're not going to get perfect relational affirmation. In the ancient polis, your self-worth and you would be affirmed by everybody. And you'd also get confirmation that what you're choosing is virtuous, because everybody would agree on what's morally right or wrong. But in our modern societies, we have a plurality of views about the good life, about how to live, about morality. And we'll be talking more about those conflicts in the next section. But there are different roles that people face, and sort of, I mentioned work-life balance. So that's one issue. There's, you might think, pressures and temptations to give into moral vice, because it looks like in certain contexts, you might think some people can get ahead by being morally vicious, right? And so that's what's in debate in this last section. We'll be talking more about that as we go on. Tessman's brought up the possibilities of socially supported forms of moral ignorance or illusion. So we'll be wanting to worry about that as we go on. And so the main things we're going to be sort of going on talking about later in the course will be what kind of relatedness requires virtue. So if you aren't moral and you start having moral vices, or someone has moral vices, what kind of relatedness to other people is being impeded there? And how does that impact their well-being or not? Second question we're going to be wondering about is, when you think about the fact that being virtuous might come with costs, right? And it might be differential, it might be a greater cost if you're a more impressed group, but it might still be a significant cost if you're in a dominant group. Are those costs worth paying? And so what kind of cost do you experience in terms of the quality of your own life if you're virtuous? And should you be virtuous if there is a cost? How demanding can morality be where you're going to be willing to pay the price? And so we'll be seeing when we read Kant, he's going to try to convince you that you have very strong reasons to be very moral, even if it comes at great personal cost to you. So we'll be getting into those issues. And then the other thing is that you should hopefully see from Tasman, she's trying to give you some pressure to worry about whether you have moral knowledge. Do you really know what is morally right or wrong? You might be in a society that teaches you you're perfectly morally okay doing certain things. That might just be a socially reinforced form of ignorance. And so you got to figure out, how can we figure out what it takes to be moral? And so that might be in your self-interest to do if Basser's right. But you might also think there's some kind of just moral imperative to seek moral knowledge, or you might think something like rationality is going to pressure you to develop more moral knowledge. And so we'll be talking about all of those when we get into Kant and some of the other views of morality going forward. So that's it for today, and good luck on the midterm. And I'll be getting back in touch with you the week after the midterm. So you got after the midterm on Monday, the rest of that week is off. And I hope you enjoy it. Hope you get some more nice weather. So take care.